The autumn wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain as Elena Martinez stood on the auction platform in Broken Arrow, Colorado territory. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the crowd of men gathered below. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that made hardened miners forget their manners and wealthy ranchers reach deeper into their pockets. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Hutchins, called for attention. "Gentlemen, we have here a fine specimen, young, healthy, and educated. Perfect for household management or ... other arrangements. Bidding starts at $50. Elena's jaw tightened at the crude description. 6 months ago, she had been living peacefully with her grandmother in Santa Fe, teaching children and tending their small garden. Then her grandmother died, leaving debts that Elena couldn't pay. When the creditors came, they offered her a choice: prison or indenture. Contract bound her to work for whoever purchased her debt until it was fully repaid. The bidding began slowly. It gained momentum as more men joined the competition. Elena tried to block out their voices, focusing instead on memories of her grandmother's gentle hands, teaching her to read and write in both Spanish and English. $100, called a voice from the back of the crowd. Elena's attention was drawn to 3 men standing together near the platform's edge. They seemed different from the usual collection of lonely prospectors and crude ranch hands who attended these auctions. The tallest of the 3, a man with sandy brown hair and intelligent blue eyes, had called out the bid.
$120,
countered a bearded miner, whose clothes reeked of whiskey and unwashed leather. The sandy-haired man conferred quietly with his companions before raising his hand again. $150. His partners nodded in agreement. One was a stocky man with prematurely gray hair and calloused hands that marked him as someone familiar with hard work. The other was younger, perhaps in his early 20s, with dark hair, and the kind of restless energy that suggested he was more comfortable on horseback than standing still. "Do I hear 160? Jens called out, his eyes gleaming with greed. The bearded miner spat tobacco juice into the dust and shook his head. Several other potential bidders stepped back, recognizing that the 3 men had serious money and determination. Going once, going twice. "Sold to the gentleman for $150. Elena felt her stomach drop as the reality of her situation crystallized, as she belonged to these 3 strangers now, bound by law and circumstance to serve them. Until her grandmother's debts were satisfied, the sandy-haired man approached the platform as Hutchins counted his money. "Miss Martinez, I'm Thomas Whitman. These are my partners, Samuel Brooks and Jake Morrison. We own the Triple W Ranch about 20 miles north of here." Lena studied their faces, searching for signs of cruelty or ill intent. Thomas Whitman's eyes held a kindness that surprised her, while Samuel Brooks seemed more businesslike, but not unkind. Jake Morrison, the youngest, appeared nervous and kept glancing at her face before looking away. "What exactly do you expect?" "From me?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Thomas removed his hat respectfully. "We need someone to manage the household, cook meals, and help with the books. The ranch is profitable, but we've been living like bachelors for too long. We need civilizing influence, and that's all?" Elena pressed, knowing that many men who purchased women at these auctions had darker intentions. Samuel Brooks stepped forward. "Miss Martinez, we're business partners, we don't share personal arrangements. Each of us has our own quarters, and you'd have your own room with a lock on the door. We need a housekeeper and manager, nothing more." Lena felt a small measure of relief, though she remained cautious. Men often said one thing and meant another, especially when they held legal power over a woman. Jake Morrison finally spoke up, his voice younger and less assured than his partner's. "Miss, we know this situation isn't ideal for you, but we'll treat you with respect. You have our word." The sincerity in his voice surprised Elena. Unlike many men she'd encountered, Jake seemed genuinely concerned about her comfort and dignity. Thomas produced a folded paper from his coat. "This is a copy of your indenture contract. Your debt totals $200, including interest and fees. At fair wages, you should be able to work it off in approximately 2 years, assuming you're willing to stay and fulfill the terms." Elena accepted the document, grateful that these men were treating her as a person capable of understanding her own situation rather than as property to be managed. 2 years, she repeated, testing the words. It seemed like a lifetime, but it was finite. She had endured worse uncertainty. We'll provide room, board, clothing allowance, and credit against your debt, Samuel added. If you prove reliable and capable, we might be able to arrange additional compensation to reduce the timeline. As they walked toward their wagon, Alina noticed the way the 3 men interacted. Thomas appeared to be the natural leader, making decisions and speaking for the group. Samuel handled practical matters with methodical precision. Jake seemed to defer to his older partners, but watched Alina with an attention that made her self-conscious. The wagon ride to the Triple W Ranch took most of the afternoon. The landscape gradually changed from the dusty streets of Broken Arrow to rolling hills covered with autumn grass. Alina found herself admiring the beauty of the territory despite her circumstances. Thomas drove the wagon while Samuel and Jake rode alongside on horseback. Occasionally, Jake would drop back to ask if she needed water or if the sun was too bright. His consideration stood out against the indifference she'd experienced from most men during her recent ordeal. Tell me about the ranch, Alina said too. Thomas, partly from curiosity and partly to distract herself from her uncertain future. We've been partners for 3 years now, Thomas replied, guiding the horses around a rocky outcrop. Started with a small herd and some leased grazing land. Now we run about 500 head of cattle and own 2,000 acres outright. How did 3 such different men become partners? Thomas smiled. Samuel's got the business sense I handle. Negotiations and planning, and Jake knows cattle better than anyone I've ever met. We complement each other's strengths and cover each other's weaknesses. Lena glanced at Jake, who was watching a hawk circle overhead. There was something in his posture that suggested he was more aware of her presence than he pretended to be. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Alina caught her first glimpse of the Triple W Ranch. The main house was larger than she'd expected, built of solid timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Several outbuildings dotted the property, and she could see cattle grazing in distant pastures. Home, Thomas announced, though Alina wondered if she would ever truly think of it that way. Elena's first morning at the Triple W Ranch began before dawn with the sound of boots on wooden floors and muffled voices discussing the day's work. She had slept poorly in the small but clean room they'd provided, her mind racing with questions about her new life and the 3 men who now controlled her fate. When she emerged from her quarters, she found the kitchen in a state that could only be described as bachelor chaos. Dirty dishes were stacked precariously in a wooden tub. Coffee grounds were scattered across the counter, and the remains of what might have been breakfast lay congealing in a cast-iron pan. Thomas looked up from his seat at the rough wooden table, a cup of coffee in his hands and an apologetic expression on his face. Miss Martinez, I'm afraid we're not much for housekeeping. Samuel's already out checking the north pasture, and Jake's in the barn tending to a mare that's about to foal. Alina surveyed the disaster with a mixture of dismay and determination. Mr. Whitman, exactly how long has it been since this kitchen was properly cleaned? Thomas had the grace to look embarrassed. Well, we hired a woman from town to come out once a week, but she quit about a month ago. Said we were hopeless cases and she wasn't running a charity for slovenly men. Alina rolled up her sleeves, grateful to have a clear task to focus on. I'll need hot water, soap, and clean rags. Also, someone will need to go to town for proper supplies if you expect decent meals. Of course, whatever you need. Thomas stood, clearly eager to escape the domestic sphere for the familiar territory of ranch work. Jake usually handles the supply runs. I'll have him make a list with you before he goes. As Thomas headed toward the door, Alina called after him. Mr. Whitman, what are the household rules? What time do you expect meals? Are there areas of the house that are off limits to me? Thomas paused, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Miss Martinez, we're not tyrants. You're here to work, not to be imprisoned. Take care of the house, cook decent meals, and help Samuel with the books when he needs it. Beyond that, your time is your own. Alina nodded, appreciating his straightforward approach. After Thomas left, she spent the morning transforming the kitchen from chaos to order. The work was familiar and soothing, reminding her of helping her grandmother maintain their small home in Santa Fe. Around midday, Jake Morrison appeared. In the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, and dust on his clothes, he seemed surprised by the transformation. This looks ... different. Lena paused in her scrubbing of the wooden counter. Different good or different bad? Good, Jake said quickly. Definitely good. I just didn't expect. It's been a long time since this place looked like a real home. She noticed that Jake seemed more at ease talking to her than he had the previous day. Without the presence of his older partners, some of his nervousness had disappeared. Mr. Whitman said you handle supply runs to town? I'll need various things if I'm to cook proper meals. Jake nodded eagerly. Of course. Was planning to go. Tomorrow anyway. We need grain for the horses and some other supplies. Lena began listing items while Jake wrote them down in a careful, precise hand that surprised her. His penmanship was educated, suggesting more formal schooling than she might have expected from a ranch hand. You write well, she observed. Jake looked up from his list, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. My mother insisted on education, said it didn't matter if a man planned to work with his hands, he still needed to work with his mind. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Jake's expression grew wistful. She died when I was 16. Fever took her in 3 days. Alina felt a pang of recognition. I'm sorry. I lost my grandmother recently. She raised me after my parents died. They shared a moment of understanding to young people who had learned early that life could be both precious and fragile. That how you ended up ... here? Jake asked. Gently, Alina hesitated, then decided honesty might serve her better than evasion. She left debts I couldn't pay. The creditors offered me prison or indenture. It wasn't much of a choice. Jake's jaw tightened with anger. That's not right. Putting someone in bondage over debts they didn't even create, Alina replied, with a shrug that didn't entirely hide her bitterness. Legal doesn't make it right. Vehemence in his voice surprised her. She studied his face, noting the genuine outrage in his dark eyes. Mr. Morrison, may I ask how old you are? 22. Why? You seem young to be a full partner in a ranch this size. Jake smiled for the first time since she'd met him. Thomas and Samuel took a chance on me 2 years ago. I had some money from selling my family's farm after Ma died, and they needed a partner who understood cattle. Turns out we work well together. You're all content with the arrangement. 3 partners. No wives, no families. Jake's smile faded, and he looked out the window toward the grazing cattle. Samuel says marriage is expensive, and wives are nothing but trouble. Thomas had his heart broken by a woman back in Denver, and swore off romance. As for me, he trailed off, seeming reluctant to continue. As for you, Lena prompted, I suppose I always figured I'd find someone when the time was right. But there aren't many women in this territory, and most of them are already married, or, well, not the kind you'd want to build a life with. Lena understood his meaning. The frontier attracted many women seeking fresh starts, but it also drew those running from scandal or engaging in less respectable professions. Samuel Brooks chose that moment to enter the kitchen, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He stopped abruptly when he saw the clean surfaces and organized shelves. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, then quickly apologized. Pardon the language, Miss Martinez. I'm not used to having a lady in the house, Mr. Brooks. I grew up on the frontier. I've heard worse language than that. Samuel smiled, clearly relieved. Good. I was worried we'd have to watch every word and walk on eggshells. You don't need to change your behavior from me, Alina assured him. Just treat me with basic respect, and we'll get along fine. Fair enough. Samuel poured himself coffee from the fresh pot Alina had made. Jake, did you get that supply list from Miss Martinez? Yes, sir. I'll head to town first thing tomorrow morning. Samuel nodded, then turned to Alina. Miss Martinez, Thomas mentioned that you can read and write well. I could use help with the ranch books if you're willing. The numbers are getting complicated, and I'm better with cattle than with ledgers. Alina felt pleased to be offered work that required her education rather than just her domestic skills. I'd be happy to help. My grandmother taught me bookkeeping for her small business. Excellent. We'll start this afternoon if that suits you. As the day progressed, Alina began to understand the dynamics between the three partners. Thomas provided leadership and vision, Samuel handled practical operations, and Jake brought enthusiasm and an intuitive understanding of the land and animals. But she also began to notice something else. Jake found excuses to be in the house more often than not. Seemed necessary. He offered to help with tasks that didn't require assistance, and his eyes followed her movements with an attention that went beyond mere politeness. When evening came, and the three men gathered for the dinner she'd prepared, Lena observed their interactions carefully. Thomas and Samuel treated her with courteous professionalism, like a valued employee. Jake's behavior was different. He was more solicitous of her comfort, quicker to notice if she needed anything, and more engaged in conversation. After dinner, as the men discussed plans for expanding their herd, Alina excused herself to clean the dishes. Jake immediately stood to help, despite protests from his partners that such work was beneath him. "Miss Martinez," Jake said quietly, as they worked side by side, "I want you to know that if anyone gives you trouble in town tomorrow, you just tell me. Some folks around here can be unwelcoming to newcomers." Alina paused in her washing. "Are you worried about something specific?" "There's talk. Some people know about the auction, and they have opinions about indentured servants. I don't want anyone treating you poorly because of your situation." The protective tone in his voice made Alina look at him more carefully. Jake Morrison was proving to be different from what she had expected. She wasn't sure if that was good or dangerous for someone in her vulnerable position. The trip to town with Jake proved more eventful than Alina had anticipated. As their wagon rolled down Broken Arrow's main street, she noticed curious stares and whispered conversations among the townspeople. Word of the Triple W Ranch is unusual. Household arrangement had clearly spread through the small community. Jake seemed to sense her discomfort as they stopped outside Henderson's general store. "Miss Martinez, would you prefer to wait in the wagon while I gather the supplies?" Alina straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Morrison, I refuse to hide from gossip. If these people have something to say about me, they can say it to my face." Jake smiled at her show of courage. "In that case, let's get those supplies." Inside the store, Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, looked up from her ledger with obvious disapproval. "Well, if it isn't young Morrison with his new ... housekeeper." The pause before housekeeper carried a world of insinuation that made Elena's cheeks burn with anger. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Jake said evenly. "We need supplies for the ranch." As Alina read from her list, she noticed other customers entering and lingering longer than necessary, clearly hoping to catch more gossip. A thin woman in a faded dress whispered to her companion, "3 men and 1 woman living out there? It's scandalous, I tell you." Alina had endured enough. She turned to face the whispering women directly. "Ladies, if you have questions about my employment at the Triple W Ranch, I'd be happy to answer them directly rather than listen to speculation." The thin woman flushed red, but found her voice. "Miss, it's just that decent women don't live alone. With unmarried men, it gives the wrong impression." "The wrong impression about what?" Alina asked coolly. "About hard work, about earning an honest living, about fulfilling legal obligations." Jake stepped closer to Alina, his presence clearly protective. "Mrs. Patterson, Miss Martinez, is a respectable woman working as our housekeeper and bookkeeper. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me and my partners." The threat in his voice was quiet but unmistakable. Mrs. Patterson and her friend quickly found other places to be. Mrs. Henderson, meanwhile, had been tallying their purchases with obvious reluctance. "That'll be $12.30. She announced. Jake paid without argument, but Alina noticed him studying the receipt carefully. After they loaded the supplies into the wagon, he helped Alina onto the seat with particular attention to propriety, making sure she was settled before taking his own place. "Thank you," Alina said as they left town behind. "You didn't have to defend me like that." "Yes, I did," Jake replied firmly. "Those women had no right to make assumptions about your character based on your circumstances." Alina found herself studying Jake's profile as he drove. His jaw was set with determination. She realized his defense of her had been motivated by genuine respect rather than mere politeness. "Mr. Morrison, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you Your partners really purchase my indenture?" Surely there were easier ways to find domestic help. Jake was quiet for so long that Alina wondered if he would answer at all. Finally, he spoke carefully. "Thomas said we needed civilizing influence. Samuel wanted someone reliable to help with the books. As for me, ... He paused, seeming to struggle. With his words, "As for you?" "I saw how scared you looked on that platform, and I couldn't stand the thought of some of those other men buying you. At least we could offer you safety and respect." The admission surprised Alina with its honesty. She had assumed the three men were motivated purely by practical needs, not by any concern for her welfare. "That was kind of you," she said softly. "Wasn't kindness," Jake replied, his voice rough. "It was, well, it was the right thing to do." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, watching hawks circle overhead and cattle graze in distant pastures. Alina found herself relaxing in Jake's company in a way she hadn't expected. "Tell me about your life before the ranch," she said eventually. Jake's expression grew wistful. "A family had a small farm in Kansas. Nothing fancy, but it was home. After Ma died and I sold the land, I drifted for a while. Worked cattle drives, hired out to various ranches. I was starting to think I'd never have a real home again when I met Thomas and Samuel." "Do you miss Kansas?" "I miss having family," Jake admitted. "Thomas and Samuel are good partners, but it's not the same as having people who've known you your whole life." Lena understood that loneliness intimately. "I miss my grandmother every day. She was the only family I had left." "What was she like?" Lena smiled at the memories. Strong, wise, stubborn as a mule when she thought she was right. She taught school for 40 years and never let anyone tell her what she couldn't do because she was a woman. "She sounds remarkable." She was. She would have liked you, I think. Jake glanced at her with surprise. "Why do you say that?" "Because you treat me like a person instead of property." That would have mattered to her. When they arrived back at the ranch, Thomas and Samuel were waiting with news that changed everything. "Jake, we've got problems," Thomas announced as they unloaded supplies. "Cattle rustlers hit the south pasture last night. Took about 50 head. Samuel's face was grim. "Trail leads toward the Badlands. We'll need to ride hard if we want to catch them before they disappear into those canyons." Jake immediately began preparing for pursuit, but Alina noticed his reluctance to leave her alone at the ranch. "Miss Martinez," Thomas said, "we may be gone for several days. Will you be all right here by yourself?" Alina nodded, though the prospect of solitude in this remote location was daunting. "I'll be fine. The house needs work anyway. There's a shotgun in the kitchen," Samuel added. "Do you know how to use it?" "My grandmother taught me to shoot," Alina replied. "I'm not helpless." As the three men prepared to leave, Jake approached Alina with obvious concern. "Miss Martinez, if anyone comes to the ranch while we're gone, don't answer the door unless you know them. There are drifters and worse in these parts, I understand." Jake hesitated, then pulled a small derringer from his vest pocket. "Take this. It's easier to handle than the shotgun, and it's already loaded." Alina accepted the weapon, noting the warmth of Jake's fingers as they briefly touched hers. "Mr. Morrison, you seem more worried about my safety than your partners do." Jake met her eyes directly. "Maybe that's because I care more about what happens to you." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was. "Ready to address directly?" "Jake," Thomas called from the barn. "We need to ride now if we want to catch those rustlers." Jake mounted his horse reluctantly, looking back at Alina as the three men rode out. She watched from the porch until they disappeared over a distant hill, then returned to the house, feeling more alone than she had since her grandmother's death. That evening, as Alina worked on the ranch books by lamplight, she found herself thinking about Jake's parting words. His concern for her safety went beyond what an employer might feel for an employee. There had been something personal in his voice, something that suggested his feelings toward her were becoming more complicated than their business. Arrangement allowed, the realization both thrilled and terrified her. Lena was legally bound to. These men, for 2 years, dependent on their goodwill for her safety and survival. Romantic entanglements could only complicate an already difficult situation. But as she remembered the gentle way Jake had helped her from the wagon, and the fierce protectiveness in his voice when he defended her in town, Alina had to admit that her own feelings were becoming equally complicated. She was falling in love with one of the men who owned her contract. She had no idea what that might mean for her future. 3 days passed before Alina heard the sound of approaching horses. She looked out from the kitchen window to see the 3 men returning, their faces grim and their clothes dusty from hard riding. Only 2 of the stolen cattle trotted behind. Them and the set of their shoulders told her the pursuit had been largely unsuccessful. Jake was the first to dismount, his eyes immediately seeking Alina through the window. When their gazes met, she saw relief flood his features, as if he had been genuinely worried about finding her safe and well. Thomas and Samuel headed straight for the barn to tend their horses, but Jake came directly to the house, pausing to remove his hat before entering the kitchen. "Miss Martinez, any trouble while we were gone?" "None at all," Alina replied, noting the way his eyes quickly scanned her face and form, checking for signs of harm. "Oh, I did have an interesting visitor yesterday." Jake's expression immediately grew alert. "Who?" "A woman named Catherine Walsh. She said she lives about 10 miles east of here, and heard there was another woman in the area." Jake relaxed slightly. "Mrs. Walsh is a good woman. Her husband runs a small spread with sheep. What did she want?" "To welcome me to the territory and to warn me about certain complications that might arise from my situation."
Yes.
Jake's jaw tightened. "What kind of complications?" Alina poured him coffee, using the mundane task to organize her thoughts. Said some people in the territory disapprove of indenture arrangements, particularly when they involve young women and unmarried men. There's been talk of involving the territorial marshal to investigate potential improprieties. "That's ridiculous," Jake said hotly. "We've done nothing improper. I know that, and you know that, but Mrs. Walsh warned me that appearances can be dangerous in a small community. She suggested it might be wise for me to find a female companion or chaperone." Jake stared into his coffee cup, clearly troubled by this development. "Miss Martinez, I want you to know that regardless of what people say or think, we will never ask you to leave or change the arrangement unless you want to." Lena felt warmth spread through her chest at his earnest declaration. "That's very reassuring, Mr. Morrison," Jakey said quietly. "When we're alone, you can call me Jake. All this formal address seems silly after what we've shared." The intimacy of using his first name felt dangerous and thrilling. "Jake," she repeated, testing the sound of it. Thomas and Samuel entered the kitchen then, interrupting the moment. Both men looked exhausted and frustrated. "Those rustlers had a 2-day head start and knew the territory better than we did," Thomas reported. "We managed to track them into the Badlands, but they split up and scattered. We'll have to report it to the territorial marshal and hope he can do better." Samuel slumped into a chair with a heavy sigh. 50 head of prime beef just gone? Nearly $1,000 in losses? Lena served the men the dinner she had kept warm for their return. Listening as they discussed the financial impact of the theft and their plans for preventing future raids. "We need to hire more hands," Thomas concluded. "Maybe build a line shack in the south pasture so someone can keep watch." "That takes money we don't have," Samuel pointed out. "The cattle sale won't happen until spring, and we've already committed most of our reserves to winter feed." Alina cleared her throat hesitantly. "Forgive me for intruding, but I noticed some discrepancies in the books that might help your financial situation." The 3 men looked at her with surprise. "What kind of discrepancies?" Samuel asked. "You're paying twice for several services?" "Because different suppliers are billing you separately for the same deliveries. Also, there are government land incentives you haven't applied for that could reduce your property taxes significantly." Samuel leaned forward with interest. "How much money are we talking about?" Alina retrieved the ledger she had been working on. "If I'm correct, you could save nearly $300 this year and possibly more next year," Thomas whistled. "Low. Miss Martinez, that's more than we paid for your indenture. You've already earned your keep." "Lena," she said impulsively, then blushed at her own boldness. "I mean, if we're dispensing with formality?" Jake smiled at her slip, and she felt her heart flutter at the warmth in his expression. Later that evening, after Thomas and Samuel had retired to their rooms, Jake lingered in the kitchen while Alina finished cleaning up. "Alina," he said, clearly enjoying the use of her name, "I need to tell you something about what happened while we were tracking those rustlers." She paused in her dishwashing. "What is it?" "We met up with the territorial marshal, a man named Barrett. He mentioned that he'd received complaints about the Triple W Ranch and our household arrangements." Lena felt her stomach tighten with worry. "What kind of complaints?" "Someone claimed we were keeping an indentured woman in improper conditions. Barrett wants to come out here next week to investigate." The news struck Alina like a physical blow. If the territorial marshal decided their arrangement was improper, he could void her indenture contract and place her elsewhere, possibly with someone far less considerate than Jake and his partners. "What will that mean for me?" she asked quietly. Jake moved closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Lana, I won't let them separate us. If Barrett tries to take you away, we'll fight it through the territorial courts." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Elena's pulse quicken. "Jake, you can't risk your ranch for me. I'm just your indentured servant." "No," Jake said firmly, reaching out to gently touch her arm. "You're not just anything. You're—" He struggled with the words, clearly wrestling with emotions he wasn't supposed to feel. "I'm what?" Alina whispered. "You're the first person who's made this place feel like home since my mother died." The admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Lena felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "Jake, we can't. I mean, my situation makes this impossible." "Does it?" Jake asked, stepping even closer. "Alina, indentured servants can marry. The contract would transfer to the husband, but the debt would remain the same." Elena's heart began pounding at the suggestion. "Are you... Are you asking me to marry you?" Jake's face flushed red. "I'm saying that if Marshal Barrett tries to take you away, marriage would be one way to keep you safe while maintaining propriety." "A marriage of convenience," Elena said, trying to ignore the disappointment in her voice. "Would it have to be?" Jake asked softly. "Alina, these past few weeks, I've come to care for you in ways I never expected. Not as a servant or employee, but as a woman I respect and love." The word love seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Alina felt her world tilting on its axis. "Jake, you barely know me. I know that you're brave and intelligent and kind. I know that you work harder than anyone should have to, and you never complain about the circumstances that brought you here. I know that when you smile, it lights up this entire house." Alina struggled to process what he was saying. "But your partners? What would Thomas and Samuel say?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "But Alina, I can't stand the thought of losing you. If Marshal Barrett decides our current arrangement is improper, at least as my wife you'd be protected by law." Alina looked into Jake's earnest face, seeing hope and fear warring in his expression. The practical part of her recognized the wisdom in his suggestion. Marriage would provide legal protection and social respectability. But the romantic part of her heart yearned for something more than a convenient arrangement. "Jake," she said, carefully, "if we were to marry, what would you expect from me? What would our relationship be?" Jake's face softened. "I'd expect what any man hopes for in a marriage. Partnership, companionship, maybe children someday if you wanted them. Alina, I'd never force anything on you. Whatever developed between us would have to be real and willing on both sides." The sincerity in his voice convinced Alina that Jake Morrison was unlike any man she had ever known. He was offering her not just protection, but the possibility of genuine love and partnership. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. Jake nodded, though. She could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Of course, this is a big decision, and I don't want you to feel pressured." As Alina prepared for bed that night, her mind churned with possibilities and complications. Marriage to Jake would solve some problems, but create others. She would still be bound by debt, but to a husband instead of 3 partners. And if their marriage was discovered to be a sham designed to circumvent the law, consequences could be severe for all of them. But as she remembered the gentle way Jake had touched her arm and the fierce protectiveness in his voice. Lena realized that her feelings for him had already grown beyond the bounds of their business arrangement. The question was whether she had the courage to risk everything for the possibility of love. Marshall Barrett arrived on a crisp October morning, his badge glinting in the autumn sunlight as he dismounted from his horse. Alina watched from the kitchen window as Thomas and Samuel emerged from the barn to greet him, their expressions carefully neutral, despite the tension she knew they felt. Jake had been pacing the house since dawn, his nervous energy filling the space like electricity before a storm. He paused beside Alina at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "remember what we discussed?" Alina nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the simple gold band Jake had given her the night before. It made their decision after hours of whispered conversation on the front porch, watching stars wheel overhead while they planned a future that might save them both. "Miss Martinez," Marshall Barrett called through the open door, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law. "I'd like to speak with you privately." Lena smoothed her skirts and walked outside, Jake following despite Barrett's emphasis. "On privately?" The marshal was a lean man with gray-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Marshall Barrett," Alina said with a slight curtsy. "I understand you have questions about my employment here." Barrett studied her face intently. "Miss Martinez, I've received complaints suggesting that your living situation here is improper for a young, unmarried woman. Are you being treated with appropriate respect and dignity?" "Yes, sir, I am." "Are you sharing sleeping quarters with any of these men?" "Absolutely not. I have my own room with a lock on the door." Barrett made notes in a small leather book. "What exactly are your duties here?" "I manage the household, cook meals, clean, and assist with bookkeeping. Nothing more." Jake stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Marshall, there's something you should know. Miss Martinez and I were married yesterday in Broken Arrow. She's no longer an unmarried woman living with 3 men. Barrett's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and Alina saw Thomas and Samuel exchange startled glances. They had agreed to keep the marriage secret until after Barrett's visit, but Jake had clearly decided that honesty was the better strategy. "Married?" Barrett repeated, his tone skeptical. Remarkably convenient timing. Jake produced a folded document from his vest pocket. "Here's the marriage certificate, signed by Judge Hopkins and properly witnessed." Barrett examined the certificate carefully, checking the signatures and dates. Alina held her breath, knowing that their future hung on whether the marshal believed. Their hasty marriage was genuine. "This appears to be legitimate," Barrett admitted grudgingly. "But I have to ask why the sudden urgency to marry? You've only known each other for a few weeks." Alina found her voice, surprised by her own steadiness. "Marshall, sometimes people simply recognize that they're meant to be together. Jake treated me with kindness and respect from the moment we met. When he asked me to marry him, I didn't need time to think about it." The lie came smoothly, but Alina was startled to realize it wasn't entirely false. She had come to care deeply for Jake, and his proposal had offered her something she had never expected to find: the possibility of genuine partnership and love. Barrett turned to Thomas and Samuel. "Gentlemen, what's your position on this development? How does this marriage affect your business arrangement?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Marshall, Jake's our partner, not our employee. If he chooses to marry, that's his decision. Mrs. Morrison will continue to manage our household. But now she'll be doing so as Jake's wife, rather than as an indentured servant." "And the debt that brought her here?" Samuel stepped forward. "Debt transfers to her husband, as is legal and proper. Jake has assumed responsibility for it." Barrett made more notes, clearly trying to find some flaw in their explanation. "Mrs. Morrison, are you happy with this arrangement? Do you feel you were pressured into this marriage?" Lena met the marshal's eyes directly. "No, sir," Jake gave me time to consider his proposal, and he made it clear that I could refuse without consequence. I married him because I wanted to. Again, the words held more truth than Alina had expected. Despite the practical motivations behind their marriage, she genuinely cared for Jake and was beginning to believe that their union might become something real and lasting. Barrett spent another hour questioning all of them, examining the house to verify Elena's living arrangements. In reviewing the ranch's financial records, to ensure there were no irregularities in her employment. Finally, he seemed satisfied that no laws had been broken. "Very well," he announced. "I see no evidence of impropriety. Mrs. Morrison appears to be well treated and genuinely content with her situation." Alina felt relief wash over her as Barrett mounted his horse and rode away. But the relief was quickly replaced by awareness of her new reality. She was now Jake Morrison's wife, bound to him by law as surely as she had been bound by her indenture contract. After the marshal disappeared over the hill, Thomas and Samuel approached the newlyweds with expressions mixing congratulation. "Concern, Jake," Thomas said carefully. "I hope you know what you're doing. Marriage is a big step, especially under these circumstances." "We know," Jake replied, his arm sliding protectively around Elena's waist. "But it was the right thing, too." Samuel studied Elena's face with shrewd eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, I hope this won't change your willingness to help with the ranch business. We've come to depend on your skills." "Of course not," Elena assured him. "I'll continue to fulfill my obligations." "Good," Thomas smiled some of the tension leaving his face. "Congratulations to both of you. I think this calls for a celebration dinner." That evening, as Elena prepared a special meal to mark their marriage, Jake found excuses to help her in the kitchen. They worked side by side in companionable silence, both acutely aware of how their relationship had changed, yet uncertain what it meant for their future. "Lena," Jake said finally, "about our sleeping arrangements, ... She looked up from the chicken she was preparing, her cheeks warming with a blush. "I don't expect anything to change immediately," Jake continued quickly. "We can take our time getting to know each other as husband and wife. There's no rush." Elena felt gratitude in something else's appointment. At his consideration, "Jake, we need to talk about what kind of marriage this really is." Jake set down the plates he had been arranging. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are we married just to solve a legal problem, or do you hope this might become a real marriage someday?" Jake studied her face intently. "Elena, I won't lie to you. I hoped you might come to care for me the way I've come to care for you. But I don't want you to feel obligated because of our circumstances." Lena felt her heart racing as she realized they were approaching the crucial moment that would define their relationship. "Jake, what if I told you that I already do care for you? What if this marriage isn't just convenient for me, but something I genuinely want?" Jake's eyes widened with hope and surprise. "Do you mean that?" "I think I do," Elena admitted. "Past weeks, you've shown me more kindness and respect than any man ever has. When you defended me in town, when you worried about my safety while you were away, when you offered to fight the territorial courts to keep me safe, I realized that. What I feel for you goes beyond gratitude." Jake reached for her hands, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Elena, are you saying you could love me? Not because you have to, but because you want to?" Elena looked into his earnest face, seeing hope and vulnerability in his dark eyes. In that moment, she realized that her practical marriage of convenience had already become something much more precious. "Jake Morrison," she said softly, "I think I already do love you." The words hung in the air between them, transforming their hasty marriage from a legal strategy into the foundation for something real and lasting. Jake pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. "Elena Morrison," he whispered against her hair, "I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice." As Elena melted into her husband's embrace, she realized that sometimes the most unexpected paths led to the most precious destinations. She had been sold into servitude, but she had found love. She had lost her freedom, but gained a partner who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. Their marriage might have begun as a necessity, but Elena was determined to make it a choice they would never regret. 6 months later, Elena stood in the doorway of the ranch house, watching Jake work with a new colt in the corral. The spring sunshine warmed her face as she absently rubbed her growing belly, feeling the baby kick beneath her hand. Their marriage had indeed become everything they had hoped for and more. The winter had been long but peaceful, giving Elena and Jake time to truly know each other as husband and wife. What had begun as a practical arrangement had blossomed into a love deeper than either had dared imagine possible. "How's our little one today?" Jake asked. approaching the porch after finishing with the horses. He had developed the habit of greeting both Alina and their unborn child each time he came to the house. Active, Alina smiled, taking his offered hand and placing it on her belly. I think he's going to be a rider like his father. She's going to be as determined as her mother, Jake countered, his eyes soft with affection. Their relationship with Thomas and Samuel had evolved into something resembling an extended family. Both men had embraced their roles as uncles to be and had proven remarkably adaptable to sharing their bachelor sanctuary with a married couple. Alina, Thomas called. From inside the house, that letter you've been expecting arrived with the morning post. Alina's heart leaped with anticipation. She'd been corresponding with the Territorial Education Department about establishing a school in their area. Using her teaching credentials and the ranch's central location to serve scattered farming families, Jake helped her inside, where Thomas handed her a thick envelope bearing official seals. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, aware that the three men were watching her expectantly. Well, Samuel asked impatiently. The verdict? Elena's face broke into a radiant smile. They've approved the proposal. The territory will provide supplies and a teacher's salary. You can start classes this fall. Jake swept her into a careful embrace, mindful of her condition. Alina, that's wonderful. You'll finally get to teach again. We'll need to convert the old storage building into a classroom, Thomas mused, already planning the construction. It's got good light and enough space for maybe 20 students. Alina felt tears of joy prick her eyes. Teaching had been her dream since childhood, and now she would be able to share knowledge with children throughout their region. The school would serve families from various backgrounds, including some Native American children from a nearby settlement, fulfilling her long-held belief in education for all. There's something else in the letter, Alina announced, pulling out a second document. The territory is also interested in establishing a lending library here. Since we're centrally located and I have demonstrated experience with books and education. Samuel whistled low. Lena Morrison, you're going to turn our ranch into the intellectual center of the territory? Would that be so terrible? Alina asked with a laugh. Not at all, Jake assured her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. I married a remarkable woman, and I want everyone to know it. Later that afternoon, as Alina worked on lesson plans for the upcoming school, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. A year ago, she had been desperate and alone, facing an uncertain future as an indentured servant. Now, she was a wife, soon to be a mother, and preparing to fulfill her professional dreams in ways she had never imagined possible. Jake found her in their bedroom, surrounded by books and papers, her dark hair escaping from its pins as she concentrated on her work. You know, he said, settling beside her on the bed, sometimes I can hardly believe how lucky we got. Alina looked up from her plans, seeing the wonder that still sometimes crossed Jake's features when he looked at her. Lucky, Alina? When? We bought your indenture. I thought we were just solving a practical problem. I never imagined we'd find love, or that you'd transform not just our household, but our entire community. Alina set aside her papers and moved into Jake's arms, marveling at how natural and right it felt to be held by him. Jake Morrison, do you know what I was thinking about when I stood on that auction platform? What? I was thinking about how alone I felt, how uncertain my future was. I never dreamed that being sold would lead me to the love of my life. Jake tightened his embrace. Lena, I need to tell you something I've never said before. What is it? That day at the auction, when I saw you standing there looking so brave despite being afraid, I felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just sympathy or protectiveness. It was recognition. Like I was looking at someone who was meant to be part of my life. Lena pulled back to look into his eyes. You felt that immediately? I did. That's why I was so determined that we should be the ones to buy your contract. Thomas and Samuel thought it was just practical decision-making, but I knew there was something more. Alina felt tears gathering as she realized that their love story had begun even before they spoke their first words to each other. Jake. You think we would have found each other if circumstances had been different? Jake considered the question seriously. I'd like to think so. But Alina, I'm grateful every day for the path that brought us together, even if it wasn't conventional. That evening, the 4 members of their unusual household gathered for dinner, as had become their custom. Thomas raised his glass of cider in a toast to Alina for transforming our ranch into a home and our territory into a better place for all children to learn and grow. To love found in unexpected places, Samuel added, with uncharacteristic sentimentality. To family, Jake said, his eyes moving between his wife, his unborn child, and his partners who had become brothers. 2 second chances, Alina concluded, and the courage to trust that sometimes the most difficult beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. As they shared their meal, Alina marveled at the family she had gained through such unconventional circumstances. She had been sold to 3 men as an indentured servant, but one of them had broken the rules and fallen in love. In doing so, he had given her something more precious than freedom. He had given her a true home and a future filled with purpose and love. Outside, the Colorado wind carried the scent of spring grass and wildflowers, while inside the Morrison household planned for a future that would include not just cattle and land, but children's laughter, the sound of learning, and the quiet contentment that comes from building something meaningful together. Alina placed her hand on her belly, feeling their child respond to her touch, and smiled at the thought of the stories she would someday tell about how love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances. Their love story would become legend in the territory, the tale of an indentured servant who became a beloved teacher and mother, and the cowboy who risked everything to claim her heart. It was a story that proved that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most unlikely circumstances, that true love could indeed conquer the barriers of law, society, and circumstance. As the evening settled around them, Lena Morrison knew that she had found something more valuable than gold in the Colorado territory. She had found her destiny, her purpose, and the love of a lifetime, all wrapped up in the strong, gentle hands of a man who had seen her true worth when she was at her most vulnerable. Their story had begun with a transaction, but it had become a testament to the power of love to transform lives and create families in the most unexpected ways.